Hey preacher, are you looking for a boost, maybe a shot in the arm for your preaching? You just need something to kind of reinvigorate your preaching? I have a book suggestion for you. My name is Brian Catherman. I'm with SaltyBeliever.com, and today I'm talking about Joel Beeke's fantastic beast of a preaching book. It's called Reformed Preaching, Proclaiming God's Word from the heart of the preacher to the heart of his people. This is put out by Crossway. It came out in 2018, and I really enjoyed it. It took me a while to read it, but I found it to be just something that really has sort of reinvigorated my preaching. It's obviously from a Reformed background, so if you don't hold to Reformed theology, this might not be the book for you, or maybe I would encourage that you read it and just let it challenge your soul as one who preaches or teaches the Word. It is heavily focused on preaching, but it does have a lot of history and a lot of great information. So if you're not a preacher, but you are interested in this kind of topic, I would encourage you to pick it up and maybe take a look at it too. It's broke up into 3 parts, and interestingly, those parts kind of almost look a little bit like you would preach a sermon. The first part is really informative, educational. Second part is really an illustration. The last part is kind of application. But here's what we see. Part 1, Reformed experiential preaching defined and described. And if you're not familiar with the history, you might think that experiential preaching is something of kind of a charismatic new thing, but it's actually the way that preaching was discussed by the Puritans and the Reformers and people throughout history. So it really kind of draws us back, it anchors us back into some good history, but it goes through kind of what that is, how that works, what is it, what does it mean to preach from the head to the heart, who's the experiential preacher, that sort of thing. And then, boy, the large section of the book, what takes up a good amount of pages is part 2. Part 2 is the Reformed experiential preaching illustrated. And what I loved about this is it's just a lot of almost biographies from the perspective of a preacher, just to other preachers. So, chapter 5, Reformed preachers, Zwingli, some others, just Calvin, Beza, an introduction to Puritan preaching, if Sibbs and Preston and Rogers, and what about the Westminster Directory in preaching, and what about Goodwin and Shepherd as it's moving forward, Bunyan, the Dutch Reformed preachers, all the way up into the 20th century. I mean, he goes all the way to Lloyd Jones, and it's just a lot of other people in here that just kind of show you this little biography of experiential preaching, Reformed preaching illustrated. And then part 3 is kind of I really hesitate to say how to. You're not going to pick this book up if you've never preached sermons and go, oh, this is how I put together a sermon. However, it's really this is how you should drive your sermon, and this is how you should think about your sermon. Just really simply, preaching starts with balance, and it kind of gets into what that looks like. Application starts with the preacher. Effective preaching about God and man. Chapter 23, preaching the gospel to the heart. Chapter 24, preaching for holiness. So it's not like it's here's how you build the sermon, but actually here's what the sermon should be, and here's how you should preach and proclaim God's word. I really enjoyed the book. Now, it did take me a while to read. It's like Beeke's other work. Some of this stuff is a little heady, and you gotta sort of ingest it and think about it and work on it and let it just work on you. But I found it really, really enjoyable. The biographies were interesting. I almost wonder if this could have been broken into 2 separate books. Here's some biographies of preachers as one book, and here's sort of Reformed preaching without those illustrations as another. However, those illustrations really do help make the point. If you don't have a lot of time, I would say start with part 1, part 3, go back and read those illustrations. I'm sure that's not what the author intended you do, but that might be helpful. Also, just one more shout out, whoever designed the cover of this book, well done, because it is absolutely just almost a joy to look at. I mean, look at this big pulpit, and just very simple, very well done. Anyway, great book. I highly recommend it, especially if you are preaching God's word to God's people.